Here is TWSBI Blue. Let's jump straight to the end with my opinion on this ink.
The paper I'm using here is a Maruman Mnemosyne Notebook.
A truly bold blue on the page that makes me wonder why more people just don't love this. Now, perhaps it's because there is almost no color variation by pen and almost no shading in the writing samples, but the bright blue does really well at not being like other blues, while it sometimes can be very, very close. I'm gonna say that depending on certain papers, it does dry quite a bit duller, which is weird because while there's not really a huge difference, I'm just looking at my notes and they're duller than what I wrote initially. So I guess that could be it. I use a lot of blue ink, a lot more than I would prefer, but I can still see a bottle of this being very useful to me. All of the writing samples are done with a Retro 51 P51 with a fine nib, a Retro 51 Corsair with a medium nib, a Retro 51 Lincoln with a 1.1 stub.
The pen for today is a Diplomat Aero.
Now that we know my opinion on this ink, let's see how I got there with the first writing sample done on Clairfontaine. Looking at the extra fine nib, we have a nice blue on the page. It has no feathering and it has no spread. It has moments of a little bit of shading that do come through, though it doesn't shade on the majority. There's moments on this very good paper. Look at put an end to that second line. The P is darker and the U starts to lighten up. It's during the T that it gets darker. N is a nice uniform tone. N is a little bit darker at the EN, slightly lighter at the D. 2 starts lighter, gets darker. Even that, the T is lighter than the H and the at darken up a little bit from there. Looking at the medium nib, it is the same tone as the extra fine. There is no feathering and there is no spread. There is a couple of moments of shading that must be looked at. Look at moment on the first line. The T is a little bit darker than most of the word. The first M is a little bit darker than that. Little underneath that, the T stands out as a bit darker. Something noticeable is that it does have these little moments like something on the second line where the H and the G are a little bit darker than the rest of the word. Looking at the stub nib, it is the same tone as the medium with no feathering, with no spread, with no surprises there. Little moments of shading, just like with the medium. The K in looking and the G are a little bit darker than the rest of the word. I'm not lying when you look at lying on the third line, where the L and the G are a little darker than the lighter letters in the middle. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding and no ghosting. We can easily write back here. And I know someone's going to comment that when I chose lying on the stub, wrong kind of lying. I realize that. Like most inks, this one comes in a bottle. This is how the Pilot Custom 823 fits. And here is the Pelican M1000. Here is the ink level when you can no longer fill a Lamy Safari. There's approximately 8 milliliters of ink left. The next writing sample is done in a Portage reporter's notebook. Looking at the extra fine nib, it is the same tone as the Clairfontaine. We get no feathering and we get no spread. We get almost no shading. I'm going to say that almost no shading because Bilbo is a little bit darker than all of the rest of the writing, but the rest of it is fairly a uniform tone, making this pretty darn good on this paper. Looking at the medium nib, it is the same tone as the extra fine, the same tone as the Clairfontaine. We get no feathering, we get no spread, we get a couple tiny moments of shading. Not that it's shading especially well, but if we look at shaped one, that first line, you see that the A in the middle of shaped is a little bit lighter. One starts lighter and gets darker to the E. That is lighter at the first T and the A than it is at the H and T that surround them. Looking at the stub nib, it is the same tone as the medium, the same tone as the Clairfontaine. We get no feathering and we get no spread. We also get no shading. Luckily, the stub nib gives very nice line variation, having this look nice on the paper, really enjoyable, not as bold as I would prefer a blue to be, but still a very nice blue on this page. Looking at the back of the page, no bleeding, no ghosting, easily writing back here. Love this paper. There's a lot to learn by doing multiple chromatographies. The one on the left is immediately put into water for 10 to 15 seconds. The one on the right, marked with a D, is let dry for 10 minutes before putting into water. The next writing sample is done on a national brand Steno notebook. Looking at the extra fine nib, we get just as dark as it was on the Clairfontaine. We do get a very slight turquoise look to this ink, very slight. No feathering, no spread. I think the shading is nicer here than it was on the Clairfontaine. It shows up quite a bit more. You see it in lightning, in they, in stoop, spent, deal, time. There's much more of it, and it's probably because it's that slight turquoise that's helping it come through. Looking at the medium nib, it is just as dark as it is with the extra fine, just as dark as it was on the Clairfontaine, still showing that slight turquoise lean to it, very slight. Result of the tone of the paper, with no feathering, with no spread, with shading showing a little bit nicer than it did on the Clairfontaine, just about as nice as it did with the extra fine. Certainly doing a good job here, but if you wanted this to be a true blue on this paper, not a good choice. Looking at the stub nib, it is the same tone as the medium, just as dark as it was on the Clairfontaine. We have no feathering and we have no spread. We have tiny moments of shading that show up, like the K in smoke, or the G in rings, or the G and the K in cooking. That's a police car going by if you hear it, not sure. Again, there's that little turquoise lean that really makes this not the blue that I would want on this paper. Looking at the back of the page, we can easily write back here because we have no bleeding and no ghosting. Resistance tests are done to see how this ink can be expected to perform on the page, and more importantly, how hard it may be to clean from your pen. The smear is allowed to dry for 3 days before testing it. The highlighter is on the top left, pen flush is on the top right, 1/3 bleach solution is on the bottom left, and water is on the bottom right. The next writing sample is done in a Rhodia notebook. Looking at the extra fine nib, it is slightly lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine. We get no feathering, we get no spread. I'm looking at the sound bars on my audio recorder because now we have an ambulance and a fire truck going by that I'm not sure is coming through. But you know, if you record, everything's going to go on right outside your window. No shading coming through, not on the Rhodia paper. And here they are right at my window. Thank you. Looking at the medium nib, it is just a little bit darker than it was with the extra fine, just a tad bit lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine. We get no feathering, we get no spread, we do get some shading, not as well as it did on the Clairfontaine, but definitely showing itself. Look at struck on the first line, where the R and the K are a bit darker. The right next to it, the, starts lighter and gets darker at the he. Looking at the stub nib, it is the same tone as the medium, just a tad bit lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine. We get no feathering, we get no spread. We do get little tiny bits, sort of some shading. The crossing of the X in next on the first line, a little bit darker. Curled, a little bit darker than the words around it. Now up starts lighter and gets darker, but the rest of the writing is all one tone with no shading, which makes me say on the majority, don't expect the shading here. Looking at the back of the page, to no surprise, there's no bleeding and no ghosting. You could easily write back here. With over 1,000 inks reviewed, let's take a look at some color comparables.
Here is Califolio Equinox. Here is Diatramentis Christopher Columbus Atlantic Blue. Here is Diamine Imperial Blue. Here is KWZ Azure No. 1.
The next writing sample is done in a composition lab notebook. Looking at the extra fine nib, it is lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine, quite a bit lighter, really looks much more pale. It has no feathering and it has no spread because this paper performs outstanding for fountain pens. I'm always just so delighted by it. We get almost no shading, though we do get some. If you look at deal on the second line, where the E into the A is a bit darker, and they underneath it, the he is a bit darker than the T and the Y. I think this would be pretty good here. I wouldn't have a problem if a student was writing with this on here. I will say with the extra fine, it doesn't stand out against the quad rule that's on the page as well as I would prefer. It stands out and you can read it, but I see the vertical lines quite a bit and it's a little distracting. Looking at the medium nib, it is just a tad bit darker than it was with the extra fine, little lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine. We get no feathering and we get no spread. We get nothing for shading. Really uniform tone throughout. Nice blue on the page, even though it's a bit more pale than it was on the Clairfontaine, pale like it was with the extra fine. But I think it looks good. The thicker lines make the vertical lines, as I'm looking at it, disappear a little bit more. So while it's not greatly different, it's different enough that makes it work much better for this paper. Looking at the stub nib, it is the same tone as the medium, little bit lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine. We get no feathering and we get no spread. We get almost nothing for shading. Really, we're going to say this does not shade. But these thicker lines, again, with the stub nib, make now the vertical lines able to disappear visually to me as I'm reading what's on the page, making it a much better fit. So if a student's using a stub nib, for one, bonus points to them for making their writing look good, but it'll work very well here. Looking at the back of this page, no bleeding, no ghosting, perfect for a student that will be writing on the back of this page. While it's nice to see ink in the same color family, I prefer to see ink to complement the color on the page.
Here is Pen BBS number 137. Here is Pilot Yuyaki Sunset. Here is Noodler's Cooperin. Here is Robert Oster Honeybee.
The last writing sample is done on 20-pound copy paper. Looking at the extra fine nib, it is just a little lighter, a little paler than it was on the Clairfontaine. Normally I expect the copy paper to make it a little darker. It didn't here. We do get some feathering, we do get some spread. Both are manageable in what's happening. We have a couple moments, you see it at A different right at the beginning, nowhere else of shading. Makes me wonder if there's about to be a little bit of bleed that might occur there, but that's coming. Looking at the medium nib, it is, generally speaking, the same tone as it was with the extra fine, which is lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine. Yes, we have feathering. Yes, we have spread. Yes, I will say this is manageable if you really want to use this paper. It's not the end of the world in what's happening. I can read even with some of the slight spread of the letters together. It's quite a bit of spread comparing it to Clairfontaine, which is that coated paper. It's really beautiful compared to the toilet paper next to it. Looking at the stub nib, it is the same tone as the medium, lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine. Yes, it feathers. Yes, it spreads. No, it does not shade. No, it does not look as good to me as the stub has come across on all of the other papers. I would not want to use a stub with this. It loses a bit of something and it makes some of the feathering a little more stand out. Plus, the spread that occurs really does away with some of the thinner cross strokes, losing some of the nice effect of a stub nib. Looking at the back of the page, sure, the ink gets deep into the paper, it's copy paper. So I couldn't write on the back of this page because I fear I'd lose the notes that are on both sides. Nothing bled through on the other side, so if you're signing a paper like, I'm here today, let me write my name, then it's perfectly fine, it'll do. So what nib and pen do I think are going to give the best writing experience with this ink?
The paper I'm using here is yellow Rhodia paper.
The extra fine gives a nice shade of blue with an enjoyable touch of shading. The medium and the stub look almost identical with, of course, thicker lines than the extra fine. So there would be no choice here other than a dealer's choice. You get to ink it and enjoy. I will say, choose what nib you would use in terms of its width based on the paper. Don't forget about some of the tone variation that can happen on the toned papers, and avoid the stub on copy paper. I hope you got something out of this video, and thanks for watching. I want to let you know that the best way you can support this or any channel is to let retailers know where you heard of something if you go to buy.